How much greatness can you accomplish within 2 years? Manfred von Richthofen was a fighter pilot during World War I and a member of the Imperial German Air Service. From October 1915, when he enlisted in pilot school, to his eventual death in combat in April of 1918, it is stated that Manfred achieved between 73 and even 100 confirmed victories in the skies. While his career was short, his legend grew so quickly that still to this day he is considered one of the most famous war figures of all time. If you haven't already guessed, or if you aren't particularly educated in World War I history, perhaps you know Manfred by his much more popular moniker, the Red Baron. 84 years after his death, another phenom within his craft seemed to be on the same track as Manfred when it came to accomplishing greatness. In fact, he had the same nickname as the famous pilot, the Baron. I'm talking, of course, about former UFC bantamweight champion, Renan Barão. Oddly enough, Renan Barão's nickname of the Baron did not come from his dominance within the sport of MMA. Barão had been called the Baron well before his athletic career had begun. His grandmother had given Renan the nickname, stemming from an 80s Brazilian soap opera of all things. If only she knew how ironic and oddly tragic that decision would become. Renan Barão began his professional MMA career in 2005, and it unfortunately began on a loss. Fortunately for the Baron, however, this would be the only loss of his career for his next 33 fights. When Renan Barão joined the WEC promotion in June of 2010, he already had amassed a record of 24 wins, 1 loss, and 1 no contest, and had already built some hype behind his name. It didn't hurt that his training partner was the WEC featherweight champion at the time in Jose Aldo, a man who would become an all-time great of the sport, and a man whose career trajectory Renan would mirror for a time. When the WEC promotion merged with the UFC at the end of the year, Renan made good on the hype that was placed on him, quickly racking up 3 wins in the UFC promotion and earning a shot at interim bantamweight gold less than 2 years later. Renan would win that fight and would defend his interim title twice in 2013, and in both of those fights, Renan would show a level of dominance and violence rarely seen in the lower weight classes. The Baron was now riding a 30-fight unbeaten streak. He was even being considered a better fighter than the actual champion of the weight class, who was sidelined with an injury in Dominic Cruz. Barão was eventually set to fight Cruz in February of 2014 to unify the title, but Cruz would again be injured, and Barão would automatically and unceremoniously be upgraded to the undisputed champion. He defended his now unified title against the man he defeated to earn the interim belt in Uriah Faber at UFC 169. And while the stoppage was controversial, Renan still made a statement over how powerful of a fighter the Baron was at 135. However, behind the scenes, Renan Barão was paying a steep price for his performances in the cage. Weight cutting is, by all accounts of logic and reason, extremely irresponsible and dangerous. You are essentially draining your body of vital hydration and nutrients to hit a specific number on a scale, and then have a little over 24 hours to bring your body back from the brink of death, only to be continuously punched in the head and body when your organs have barely had the chance to recover from the trauma you have just inflicted on them. What began as a form of legal cheating to gain a size advantage over an opponent within the sport of wrestling in the early 1930s, weight cutting had taken over sports such as boxing, MMA, and professional bodybuilding. Over time, this practice has evolved and only become more extreme and dangerous. While Renan Barão's teammate Jose Aldo was a champion in the weight class above him at 145, when the two competed on the same card, which happened to be the aforementioned UFC 169, it was revealed that both men entered the cage around the 160-pound mark, which meant that even though Barão was roughly the same size of his teammate, he was cutting a significantly more amount of weight than him. And you could tell with each weigh-in these drastic traumas that Renan was putting on his body were taking their toll. In the Baron's next fight against Team Alpha Male standout TJ Dillashaw at UFC 173, the bill finally came due for the amount of damage Barão was putting on his body. The massive underdog in Dillashaw absolutely battered Barão all over the cage for nearly the entire 25 minutes of their title fight, before violently ending it midway through the 5th and final round with a head kick. This was the first loss in Barão's career since his first fight nearly 10 years ago. No one thought this was the end of Barão's prime. The man was barely in his late 20s. An immediate rematch was scheduled for August of 2014 at UFC 177. While Dillashaw was the slight favorite given how dominant his victory was over the Baron, there was still intrigue over whether or not the real Barão had shown up in their first fight. Unfortunately, the UFC 177 card would befall so many strings of unfortunate and strange occurrences that by the time of the weigh-ins, commentator Joe Rogan would welcome the crowd by giving it a less than savory description.
Welcome to the haunted UFC card!
And unfortunately, Renan Barão was at the center of this card's accursed nature. 2014 was a year that not many people would immediately think of when it comes to great progress. In fact, many of the world events that year were largely unfortunate. Wars and hostile takeovers were abundant, and as a society, our trust in our leaders was on a sharp decline. Nobody could have predicted the madness that would have occurred in the following years, but the seeds were definitely starting to sprout in 2014. In a way, it was a year of transition, a calm before the storm. While fighters like Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor were in the UFC, their collective stardom had yet to take off, and superstars like GSP and Anderson Silva were also completely absent. It was largely a time of stagnation and complacency. TJ Dillashaw's dethroning of Renan Barão in May at UFC 173 had injected some unexpected life into the year for the promotion, and that summer seemed to be off to the right start as well, with great performances from Chris Weidman, Conor McGregor, and Ronda Rousey to showcase the true next generation of MMA talent. Renan Barão's teammate Jose Aldo was set to defend his featherweight title at UFC 176 in August, and the Baron himself was set to attempt his revenge at UFC 177 to close out a largely positive season for the UFC. However, luck was not on the side of Camp Nova União. On July 8th, it was announced that Jose Aldo had to pull out of his event with an injury, and shortly after, the UFC announced they were canceling the event altogether, something that hadn't happened since the summer of 2012 when UFC 151 was canceled. Aldo was already gaining somewhat of a reputation of an injury-prone champion, and now being the cause of an entire event being canceled wasn't really helping dispel that narrative. The reputation of the camp all hinged now on teammate Renan Barão, and if he could regain honor for both his camp and for himself. UFC 177 was also placed in a vicarious situation through no fault of their own. Originally, the card was meant to be headlined by the rematch between Jon Jones and Alexander Gustafsson, but that fight was moved to UFC 178, which is its own dramatic and unfortunate tale. But the only relevance to this story is that Demetrius Johnson was set to defend his flyweight title in the co-main event of UFC 177, but when Jon Jones had to pull out of his fight at UFC 178, Mighty Mouse was moved to the headline spot of that card. This thinned out an already lackluster pay-per-view, putting even more pressure on Renan to perform. And, unfortunately for the Baron, not only would he not get revenge on Dillashaw, but he wouldn't even step foot in the octagon. As mentioned previously, Renan Barão's weight cuts were already starting to take their toll. 2014 was also a very different time when it came to weight cutting in the sport. While the act has gotten no less dangerous since that year, the science behind it and money invested into the health aspect of the sport has increased astronomically. How fighters go about their weight cuts has become more regimented. 2014 was a much different story, and a much darker story for the Nova União team. While head coach Andre Pederneiras claimed the camp had a very responsible weight cutting system, less than a year earlier in September of 2013, one of their fighters had passed away while trying to make weight for a regional card. And even though Jose Aldo would eventually get his weight cutting act together enough to even drop to 135 himself, through most of the 2010s, Aldo looked like death on the scales attempting to make 145. Remember, Renan Barão and Jose Aldo were the same size. The only difference was Renan Barão had to cut an additional 10 pounds to make 135. And if Renan's weight cut at 173 played a factor in him losing his title, Renan's weight cut at UFC 177 almost cost him his life. The day of the weigh-ins, it was announced that Renan Barão had been transported to the hospital due to a botched weight cut. It has been stated that Renan Barão would cut between 20 and 25 pounds for his cuts down to 135, meaning that he was depleting his already shredded physique over an additional 15% of his body weight. The story that came out from the camp was that Renan was dehydrating in a bathtub, stood up too fast, and blacked out. But when his teammates tried to catch him, Barão's body was covered in so much cream that he slipped from their grasp and knocked his head against the wall of the bathroom. Even if his team didn't leave any details out, this was enough to warrant Renan staying and rehydrating at the hospital for the entire weekend. However, later that very weekend, Renan was out of the hospital and doing an almost humiliation ritual interview with Joe Rogan, forcing to explain what happened to him during the weight cut.
Well, Renan, thank you very much. This is very disappointing and very embarrassing, not just for you, but for the UFC.
In July of 1917, the Red Baron sustained a serious head injury while flying a mission over Belgium. This injury caused immediate disorientation and blindness. It would take the Baron out of action properly for months, and many have theorized that the damage Manfred sustained from this injury was a cause that led to his eventual death. We will get to these parallels shortly, but the UFC still had a card to put on, and they were not scrapping another pay-per-view at the last minute, especially after losing UFC 176. So, what were they to do? In an ironic way, UFC 177 was full of missed opportunities and false hopes for its fighters. First and foremost, the co-main event was Tony Ferguson collecting the third win of his legendary 12-fight winning streak against Danny Castillo. Oddly, at the time, this win was considered controversial, as Tony won by split decision, and in the fight, Danny had the majority of control time on the ground. With the way the scoring criteria is today in 2026, Tony would be the winner, no question. But in 2014, control time was still factored heavily for the judges. Unfortunately for Castillo, the judges favored Ferguson's submission attempts and output. Castillo would unfortunately never have his hand raised again in MMA. In 2015, he would lose 3 more straight before being cut from the UFC, and subsequently retiring from active competition, agonizingly losing his last 2 fights by split decision as well. As for Tony Ferguson, he would go on to continue having one of the most impressive winning streaks in the lightweight division before devastatingly going on the longest losing streak in UFC history. Future doubleweight champion Henry Cejudo was supposed to have his UFC debut on the card, but he himself would have his own weight cut debacle, forcing him to pull out on the day of the weigh-ins as well. He was just fortunate enough to have his pullout eclipsed by the Baron. Betch Koeta defeating Shayna Baszler by second-round TKO was nothing to write home about at the time, but Shayna, being a training partner of Ronda Rousey, allowed Betch to use that win to catapult herself to a title shot against Ronda in 2015. Within her home nation of Brazil, on a card that did nearly 1 million buys, Betch would get knocked out by Rousey in 34 seconds, and would ultimately end her career going 11-6-1. She was by all accounts nothing special as a fighter, but she definitely made the most out of the opportunity given to her at UFC 177. Baszler herself would retire from MMA after losing 2 more fights after her fight with Koeta. However, she would go on to have a massively successful career in professional wrestling, even having a near decade-long tenure in the WWE. The only other real interesting tidbit of information on the card was the fact that the man Tony Ferguson beat to win the Ultimate Fighter in 2011 and begin his legendary career in the UFC in Ranji Nijam also fought on the card, where he unfortunately got finished in the second round. So what was the UFC to do about the main event? Well, it just so happens that another bantamweight was scheduled to compete and was a former champion in a regional promotion. That man was Joe Soto. And so instead of making his UFC debut on the prelims, Joe Soto was granted a title shot against the reigning champion on a little over a day's notice. And although Soto would gain respect managing to nearly go the full 5 rounds against Dillashaw, he was finished in an eerily similar way to how Dillashaw had finished Henin earlier in the year. And that was supposed to be it. UFC 177, while cursed, mercifully ended for all, and hopefully better times were ahead. But like many curses, the worst had yet to come for our main players of the card. The Red Baron was killed in flight action in April of 1918. The circumstances around his death were perplexing, as the Baron had made decisions that put him in unnecessary danger that many had noted were uncharacteristic of him. It has been speculated that the injury that he had sustained the previous year directly played into his lapse in decision-making. After the beating TJ Dillashaw put on him and his subsequent weight debacle at UFC 177, Renan Barão was never the same. He would go 2-8 in his remaining 10 fights, including another hellacious beating from TJ in a rematch that went on for way too long. Barão would even attempt a run at featherweight, but he wouldn't find much success, returning to bantamweight where he would miss weight 2 more times. He would eventually be cut from the UFC promotion after losing 5 straight. He would then lose a split decision in 2023 within an obscure MMA promotion in Kuwait of all places. Renan would then be signed by the failed startup promotion in the GFL in late 2024 and be actually scheduled to headline their first event in May 2025 against his former foe Uriah Faber. But fortunately for everybody, the promotion folded. Renan Barão's downfall is easily one of the most drastic and sudden falls from grace in the sport's history. When his teammate Jose Aldo was knocked out by Conor McGregor in 13 seconds, many feared the same result would befall Jr. But Aldo would go on to continue having a long and fruitful UFC career that lasted nearly 9 years longer. where he would eventually regain his belt for a time and receive numerous additional title shots. Hennon's dramatic demise, by his own admission, can be attributed to his drastic weight cuts and the toll they took on his body. TJ Dillashaw himself, although he hasn't really been a topic of this video, also had an unfortunate roller coaster to the remainder of his MMA career. At one point he was considered by many as the greatest bantamweight champion of the sport, but he ended his career being viewed as a cheater, stripped of his title and of his reputation, and ended his career in a disaster of a title fight where he entered it completely compromised. Joe Soto himself wouldn't have much of a meaningful career in the UFC. He would lose against the man he was originally scheduled to compete against at UFC 177 and would exit the UFC going 3-5. UFC 177 was not a good card. It was not a memorable fight card. The storylines that came out of it were largely negative, and not many fighters on the card had a happy ending to their careers. The card was, as Joe Rogan said, truly haunted. But sometimes you need to be reminded of why cards like this happen, why the pursuit of being remembered, like the Red Baron, can often be a fruitless and costly venture. Even the Baron himself did not get to experience his own legacy. He was never married, never had children. His entire legend lies within those 2 very short years. But legends are made because legendary accomplishments are so rare. Cards like UFC 177 are needed so that cards like UFC 300, UFC 189, and UFC 217 can feel special, even if, at times, these cards can feel a little cursed.